Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Nothing, not even elections, captures the attention of the mainstream media like war. The portability of coverage today makes war a kind of made-for-cable television event. The result is that in the fog of coverage, we lose sight, as we did with the Iraq War, of the truth of why we got in, how it's going, and how we get out. And now we find ourselves in a similar place with respect to Iran. It's true that without Trump, we wouldn't be where we are today. And yet it is ironic that it is also because of Trump that the media is more skeptical of the facts. There's no question that Soleimani was a bad guy that supported extremist militia and Iran's geopolitical overreach in the region. However, the degree to which he was responsible for the death of Americans, as has been reported, is an open question. To talk about it, I'm joined by Stephen Zunes. He's a professor of politics and a coordinator of Middle East studies at the University of San Francisco. He's the author of a recent story arguing that there's no evidence that Iran is responsible for the death of hundreds of Americans, and it is my pleasure to welcome Stephen Zunes here to Radio Who, What, Why. Stephen joins us today by cell phone from Sudan. Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Great to be with you.
Stephen, I want to begin by talking first about a point that was raised in a Washington Post column recently by former Virginia Senator Jim Webb, and where he said, when did it become okay for us to kill a general from another country in a third country with respect to a country we're not even at war with?
That's an excellent way of putting it, actually, that the United States is not at war with Iran as much as some people would like us to be so. And he was there at the invitation of the Iraqi government, a sensible U.S. ally. He was on his way to meet with the prime minister to try to defuse the crisis. And so, there are all sorts of serious legal questions regarding this. And of course, the fantasy that the Trump people have put out about how there was, that there was about to be a series of attacks against Americans, they're going to blow up the U.S. embassy, all that kind of crazy stuff. Again, absolutely no evidence to back that up, despite requests, not just from Democrats, but from Republicans in Congress too, that they come forward with this information. But what has been disturbing to me, actually, is that much of the mainstream media, including some Democrats who opposed the assassination, have seemed to be perpetuating what is apparently the inaccurate claim that Soleimani and Iran has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans.
Talk a little bit about that, because you detail in your article the fact that he is not. There's no evidence at all that he has been responsible for the death of hundreds or thousands of Americans.
Yeah, he's certainly responsible for the death of thousands of Iraqis and maybe even thousands of Syrians. I mean, the militia that he's organized, supported, are indeed pretty nasty. I mean, some Iranian allies like Houthis are incorrectly seen as proxies, but some of the groups like Hezbollah in Iraq and Syria really are proxies. That he does have a fair amount of operational control, and yeah, they're a nasty lot, no question about it. But they haven't been fighting Americans overall. There's only been a handful of deaths of Americans since the formal withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2011. None of them were attributed to these militia until the attack that killed a contract worker a couple weeks ago. And similarly, I think what the Trump administration is trying to put forward, and they haven't really put in any evidence, so it's hard to say what they're referring to, but presumably charges that were made back in 2007 by the Bush administration, where again they didn't put any proof that Iran, through a certain Shia militia they were supporting, were killing Americans by these roadside bombs that were blow up when American convoys would come by, and some close to 170 American soldiers were killed that way. And somehow Iran was responsible. And they claim that, these are roadside bombs, these IEDs, improvised explosive devices, have been killing Americans since the occupation began. But most of those, including the vast majority, 90% or more of American casualties, were done by Ba'athist groups, Salafist groups, other secular and hardline Sunni groups that, in fact, were anti-Iranian. The Iranian support militia were fighting them. In fact, they were killing each other's civilians by the thousands. I mean, these were, they were not, the people who were killing Americans tended to be fanatically anti-Iranian. And yes, there were some Shia groups like Sadr's group, the Mahdi Army, but again, they were not one of those that were tied to Iran. So even if you count the Americans killed by them, again, that's not the Iranians. The U.S. line seemed to be that these new IEDs are too sophisticated for the Iraqis to make, so they have to be Iranian. But you think, wait a minute, this is the same administration who just a few years earlier were saying the Iraqis were capable of building an atomic bomb and the sophisticated long-range missiles and that kind of thing. And suddenly you're saying that they're incapable of building a roadside bomb. It was rather ludicrous at the time. And again, this was 12 years ago. It was largely forgotten about. Again, because despite promises to do so, the Bush administration never came forward with the supposed evidence that they supposedly had that linked Iran to these attacks until until Trump started raising it as an excuse to add to his arsenal of reasons that the United States somehow needed to go to war with Iran.
Well, it's interesting with respect to that Trump has made the statement as recently as last night at a rally about the evidence of imminent danger, and yet none of this was mentioned to members of Congress in the briefing that took place the other day.
Exactly. I mean, there isn't any. I mean, this is sheer fabrication. And it's disappointing. It's very disappointing, in fact, that you had many Democrats who, again, even those who opposed the assassination, that seem to accept this at face value. And I think it also just kind of raises an even bigger question about how Iraq under Saddam Hussein was fanatically anti-Iranian, and they did not have these extremist Salafist groups like ISIS. The fact that that ISIS exists is a direct outgrowth of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. The fact that you have pro-Iranian militias is a threat to American soldiers in Iraq that are there supposedly to fight a terrorist group that we helped create, threatened by militia that we made possible to come into Iraq, again, effectively created. I mean, it shows that there's yet another, that it's another example of the United States doing something, going to war for really stupid reasons that couldn't create reasons to continue making war. And so I as much as I think we deserve to go after President Trump for his provocative actions, let's remember that it was the Bush administration that got us in this situation in the first place, and even they could have been stopped if the Democratic-controlled Senate hadn't had some key defections, such as Dianne Feinstein, Chuck Schumer, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, and significantly Joe Biden. Senator Barbara Boxer, who was opposed to the war, put in a request to allow me and Phyllis Bennis and Scott Ritter, the former chief of weapons inspector, and others to testify before Biden's committee. Biden was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but he blocked our testimony. And instead, not only did he allow only a day and a half of hearings, but he stacked the hearings with these pro-war voices, including these dubious Iraqi exiles that have been coached by Dick Cheney and Ahmed Salabi to all these fanciful tales of having seen stocks of nuclear weapons, and how if the U.S. came in, we'd be welcomed as liberators, and there'd be peace and harmony in Iraq. And I mean, unfortunately, I mean, every prediction I made about the Iraq War, the invasion, unfortunately, became true. I wrote the cover story in The Nation magazine, The Case Against War, and I talked about the sectarian conflict, the rise of Salafist extremism, et cetera, et cetera. The one prediction I got wrong was that any Democrat who supported what was predictably a disastrous decision, not to mention illegal and unnecessary, would have his or her political career ended. And instead, we have nominated pro-war John Kerry and pro-war Hillary Clinton as the nominees. Chuck Schumer is the head Democrat in the Senate, and Joe Biden not only got to become vice president, but he's still the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination this year.
It seems that there are two tracks with respect to these arguments, with respect to what went on in Iraq and where we seem to be headed with Iran. There is the case that can or can't be made for the assassination of Soleimani, but what happens in these cases is not unlike what happens in politics. The cover-up becomes worse than the crime. By trying to justify the actions for dishonest reasons, it creates a scenario that has a life all of its own that transcends the original action.
Exactly. And the thing is that, again, Soleimani's militia have been ruthless. They killed a lot of civilians supporting Assad's war in Syria. And in fighting ISIS, they have gone after a lot of Sunnis and Sunnis in general. Indeed, they've been implicated in many of the 500 or more deaths of pro-democracy, anti-corruption demonstrators that have taken the streets of Baghdad and other Iraqi cities in recent months. And indeed, one could be very critical of Iran's actions throughout the region. But by making stuff up, by exaggerating things, there's very little in terms of the credibility of legitimate concerns the international community may have. And furthermore, despite Trump's claim that our taking a tough stance will empower Iranian dissidents, it's doing just the opposite. I mean, the thing. I noticed this when I was in Iran this past spring. That people were really disgusted with the government. I mean, the government's really unpopular, and people were not afraid to talk to me and visiting America how much they hated the regime. But it was also clear they were very much opposed to U.S. policy and the threats against them. And the millions of people who came out of the streets protesting Soleimani's assassination. I mean, it's really united Iranians in a way they haven't been able to do in years. And similarly, it's crippled the pro-democracy movement in Iraq as people have rallied around the flag there against the United States and against the assassination taking place on their soil. So and it underscores that the United States is really not interested in promoting democracy. In fact, we are entrenching some of the worst reactionary forces in that part of the world. And indeed, if you think of all the terrible things that Trump and others have accused Iran of doing, suppression of dissent, lack of free election, discrimination against women and religious minorities, supporting extremist groups, intervening in the internal affairs of other countries, and all those are true. But every one of those is also true of Saudi Arabia. In fact, I'd say every one of those, Saudi Arabia is even worse than Iran. So, and yet we spend billions of dollars of unconditional military aid, arms transfers, and security assistance to that regime, as we do Egypt, United Arab Emirates. I mean, Egypt, that's taxpayer funded most of it, $1.4 billion to prop up the Sisi dictatorship. Meanwhile, here in Sudan, they had a regime that was even worse than Iran. The president was died for genocide in Darfur. They supported Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups for a while. I mean, really nasty government. And guess what? The people of Sudan rose up in a nonviolent pro-democracy civil insurrection and overthrew the regime. And they now have a democratic government under civilian leadership after 30 years of this far right-wing Islamist military dictatorship. And And as a reminder, if we really want democracy in that part of the world, if we really want to fight extremism, let the people do it themselves. When the United States intervenes, we just make matters worse. In fact, let me just throw in something. While we're supporting all these repressive regimes, the Trump administration still maintains sanctions on Sudan, even though they're under a democratic civilian leadership. I mean, strict sanctions that makes them very, very difficult for them to get any loans or international financial support, because as with Iran, it does not just involve the U.S., but it affects other nations and international financial institutions as well.
Given where we are now, given the lies that have been told, the misinformation that's been put out there, and then the misinformation that's been layered on more misinformation already in the course of 1 week, how do you see this playing out?
I mean, I guess the good side is that despite too many people buying the Iran has killed hundreds of Americans assertions, that generally there has been a greater skepticism that there's and the fact that Iran gave a very limited, very targeted response so they could save face, but not did it in such a way to give Trump an excuse for further escalation, and that Trump actually held back himself. I mean, we were really on the precipice there for a while, and it's just a miracle that things, at least for now, seem to have calmed down. I mean, you have the tragedy of the Ukrainian airliner, which apparently was shot down by a nervous anti-aircraft missile operator, thinking it was a U.S. attack. But so we have already had tragic losses. At least it's not going to escalate for now. But it does kind of remind that we are on a hair trigger, that we are on a very difficult situation where something could get out of hand, where having American forces in a volatile place like Iraq, Americans could get killed, not necessarily by a pro-Iranian militia, but by somebody, and Trump could blame it on Iran, and lo and behold, here things escalate again, and we end up in a full-scale war. I think the real key we need to do right now is to try to get Congress to force Trump to pull American troops out of Iraq. I mean, the Iraqis want them out. In fact, the Iraqi parliament has voted to get them out, though that decision is still in the hands of the prime minister. And Trump has threatened to put even bigger sanctions on Iraq than they have on Iran if they dare not let us keep troops in their country. Again, it's an example of the arrogance that we have. So I think the best thing we can do right now, really, to prevent things from getting worse, is to really push the demand, not just that we not have a war with Iran, but we get U.S. troops out of Iraq, because the Iraqis do not want American or Iranian troops there. They don't want these militias lie with one side or other. They don't want to be the location of a proxy war between the U.S. and Iran. The big division in Iraq nowadays is not between Sunni and Shia, but between sectarian and nationalist elements within both communities. And the largely youthful protests were in a large part against this kind of sectarianism. And the Iraqi people want both Iran and the United States out of their country, and we should honor that.
Does the U.S. pulling out, though, create greater opportunity for the Iranians, create a vacuum which the Iranians, because of simple proximity, will fill much faster?
I mean, that's possible, and indeed that was one of the warnings we had about the consequences of overthrowing Saddam Hussein and creating chaos within the country. At the same time, just as the U.S. has justified its presence in Iraq in large part to counter Iranian influence, the Iranians have done the same. And the fact that the U.S. has these bases so close to the Iranian border is one thing that has emboldened Iran's more expansionist agenda and wanting to create to maintain a strong presence there. I mean, ideally there'd be some thoughtfully negotiated situation where both sides would pull out, but I can't imagine that taking place under Trump. I mean, he and his team are not known for their thoughtful skill in negotiations on sensitive issues. But frankly, I think the Iraqi people have shown that they are willing to fight against that. I mean, the United States put enormous pressure on Syria for their overbearing presence on Lebanon for years. We supported Israel engaging in these horrific bombing campaigns and an occupation of the southern part of the country, all in the name of trying to pressure the Syrians to leave. That we imposed draconian sanctions on Syria, trying to pressure them to leave Lebanon. None of that worked. What worked was when hundreds of thousands of Lebanese took to the streets in 2005, demanding that they pull out, and that's what worked. So, in other words, we need to leave it to the people of Iraq themselves to get rid of the Iranians, not provoke a war, which is not going to do anybody any good.
Finally, let me ask you about Soleimani and whether or not he was sui generis to the situation, whether his control of the various insurgent and militia groups was unique, or will he simply be replaced by somebody else whose tentacles reach just as far?
I think you have a very good point there. I mean, Soleimani was very influential and charismatic, and was particularly close to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And so, I doubt there'd be someone of his stature that his replacement or other possible replacements would reach. But nevertheless, this is part of a much broader policy. I mean, Iran has been a major power in the region for, and keep in mind that Iran, formerly known as Persia, has been a major power in the region for on and off for close to 2,500 years. And they, like any major power in a region, are going to try to assert themselves. And that's just as we've seen other other major powers try to influence their regions as well. And it's not, they don't always do it in a way that is a good thing for the people. I mean, again, the people in the Middle East have every right to resist overbearing Iranian influence, but it's inevitable in a lot of ways. And I don't see that Soleimani's absence is going to mean a fundamental shift in Iranian policy. And if anything, given the extent to which the United States has gone to try to fight Iran, I think it's only going to embolden them to strengthen their military presence.
Stephen Zunes, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.